So now I have a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jung-Suk Kim, who is the president of CAPWIP, and she is the chairperson of the board of directors of the Korean Institute for Women and Politics. That was founded in 1990 when there were only very few women in the National Assembly Parliament. But she founded that organization and she started pushing the government to have more women in the decision making at every level. And when they started, they didn't think that we could have such a fast advancement into the politics because it was so close to women. It was a very closed area for women. But within a few years, she was elected as a congresswoman for 3 times. And then she played a critical role in changing the rules and regulations of major political parties to give 50% quota for women in local and national assemblies. So it was in 2003 that came true. Dr. Kim is the forefront of the advocacy for education reform and women's participation in public decision-making in South Korea. She holds a doctorate degree in higher education from George Washington University, and at the present time, she's a visiting professor of Graduate School of Education of Korea University in Seoul, Korea. She was the Vice Minister of Political Affairs too. She was the member of the National Assembly 3 times, and she has been the speaker on political empowerment of women. And she also led many panels during the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York. So please, and also she, at the present time, she is the head of an NGO, the Girl Scouts of Korea. And so please welcome Dr. Kim. She will speak on the progress of women in politics and governance, updates, and the way forward. Please welcome.
Good afternoon. Time is so limited. I'm not sure to finish in 20 minutes, but anyway, I'll try to do my best by reading the materials. Climate change, since yesterday, climate change is almost certainly the greatest threat to nature and humanity in the 21st century. Presently, we begin to see some of the impact of the climate change. Many take the form of natural disasters around the world, be it melting glaciers, rising sea levels, more powerful and destructive storms, more severe floods, less snow in the north, more drought in the south. This effect, in turn, begin to seriously impact human civilization. Some of the primary measures needed for meaningful adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction are protection of environmental resources, care with land use planning, zoning, and building codes, and most importantly, sustained political commitment in the form of policies, budgets, and administrative systems to drive and support an effective risk reduction agenda. The time is now for each country to make meaningful movement toward policies which confront climate change and which reduce risk of disaster. Moreover, movement must occur at all levels, local, national, and international. However, Women are generally thus far being excluded from the discussions despite being the biggest victims of climate change and consequent disaster. Ironically, women in many countries have the potential to be the most effective agents for restoring and protecting the environment. One method to promote adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction at the national level is to provide legal and institutional framework to facilitate the process. The argument of my paper is that my presentation here is therefore women have full access to the politics and the governance of countries to be effective agents of adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction. At this time, relatively few women legislators are engaged in climate change responses and programs for disaster risk reduction. The purpose of my presentation is to review the state of global and local response to climate change, and to highlight reasons why and how women can play a central role in human response to climate change, and to make recommendations for legislatures and challenge women legislators to be engaged in climate change responses. And also, we will consider the ways to promote women's political participation for adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction. Regarding the gender-responsive legislation in mitigation of climate change and disaster risk reduction, the reason why we need gender mainstreaming in adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction can be summarized as follows. Firstly, male-centered view of nature and the world, militarism, short-sighted economic growth models, and the abuse of science and technology has spawned problems for women and environment that are mutually interrelated. Such problems include the subjugation of women and exclusion of women from formulation of development and environment policies. In order to make amendment, a substantial role of women for the protection of the environment must be emphasized, and women's participation in formulation and enactment of environment related to policies should be greatly expanded. Secondly, it is a universal belief that gender-sensitive perspectives should be integrated into sustainable development, based upon ECOSOC definition of mainstreaming of gender-responsive perspectives and Agenda 21. Thirdly, women should share the benefit of policies responding to climate change. In the fierce market competition of low-carbon business, women's interests tend to be ignored when they are not properly represented in an organized fashion. Fourthly, there are gender differences regarding experience in climate change and disaster. Women are the primary victim of disasters that result from climate change. Women accounted for more than 75% of victims in the year of 2005 tsunami. What's more, the deaths of mothers resulted in a high infant mortality rate, early marriage, neglected education for young girls,